Okay, this time we're going to be talking about Kant's first formulation of his categorical imperative. One way to get a grip on the first formulation is to begin by asking the question, what makes human beings subject to moral obligations where other animals like lions, bears, and perhaps dogs are not subject to moral obligations? Well, one answer, Kant's answer, is that human beings are rational, which just means that human beings are capable of acting against their desires or their inclinations for reasons. So we're capable of being motivated by reasons to act against the things that we want to do. So consider my dog, Zelda. She very strongly wants to eat an entire cake. So she has the inclination to eat that cake. And I can try to motivate her not to eat the cake by appealing to one of her other inclinations or her other desires. So she has a desire to please me. So if I show displeasure in what she's doing, she may refrain from doing it. So if I shout at her loudly, "Hey, don't eat that cake," she might stop eating it. Or if I offer her a treat that she likes a whole lot more than cake, she might prefer that treat and be moved by her stronger inclination to eat, say, an entire hot dog rather than some chocolate cake. But what I can't do is give her a reason, right? So I can't say, Zelda, eating that chocolate cake is bad for you because chocolate cake is poisonous to dogs. So you have a compelling reason to refrain from eating the cake. And the reason I can't do this is not just because she doesn't really understand complicated sentences of English, but even if she did, she wouldn't be motivated by this reason. She wouldn't be able to appreciate it as a reason to refrain from doing something that she wants to do. Right? Very young human children are a little bit like this, right? So toddlers want to do something, and you can try to appeal to other desires they have to get them to stop doing it. But what you can't do is offer them reasons because they just don't have the reasoning ability to come to appreciate the force of those reasons. Whereas I, on the other hand, I often have a strong desire or inclination to eat, say, 3 thick slices of chocolate cake for breakfast instead of a healthy breakfast. And I'm very inclined to do this, but I'm capable of appreciating the fact that I have stronger reasons not to eat 3 thick slices of chocolate cake for breakfast. So I can come to realize that because it would be tasty or because I really want to, aren't good enough reasons for me to eat the cake for breakfast. So no cake. When we think about what would constitute a good enough reason to do something, we are using our purely intellectual capacity of just reflecting on stuff. We're reasoning a priori. When we think about what's desirable or what we want, on the other hand, we're using our a posteriori capacities for thinking about stuff. So as an example, chocolate cake is tasty. But this is a fact that I know on the basis of experience by a posteriori reasoning, right? I have had experiences of chocolate cake and I've come to know that it is tasty. I don't know this just by reflecting on it. But given my inclination to eat tasty things, which I've discovered that I have by a posteriori thinking, by sort of experience, given that I have this inclination, I can come to know that the fact that the cake would taste good is some kind of reason for me to eat some, right? And this is something that I know a priori. So I think I reason to myself, well, I want to eat tasty things. Chocolate cake is a tasty thing. So given that I have the goal of eating tasty stuff, that I'm inclined to eat it, and chocolate cake is tasty, that constitutes a reason, some kind of reason for me to eat the cake. But when it comes to action, since I'm a rational creature, I don't want to act for just any old reason. I want to act for a reason that's good enough, right? A good enough or sufficient reason for action. So if something's a good enough reason for doing something, then I may do that thing whenever the reason is true, whenever it's the case. So if the fact that it would be tasty is a good enough reason for me to eat some chocolate cake, then it follows that whenever it's true that some cake is tasty, then it would have to be a good enough reason for me to eat that cake. Okay, so roughly speaking, when I decide whether or not to act, I am motivated typically by some kind of inclination or desire to approach a maxim or plan for acting. And my plan for acting or my maxim is one that it's okay for me to act on, just in case there's a principle that endorses acting on that maxim, a reason. So in the case of the cake, I am motivated by an inclination to eat tasty foods, and I consider acting on the maxim to eat 3 thick slices of chocolate cake in the interest of eating some tasty food. And the principle that I am considering acting on is that a desire for tasty foods by itself is good enough reason to eat 3 thick slices of chocolate cake. Okay. My will is inclined to adopt this maxim. I'm very strongly motivated to act on it because I really want the cake. But adopting the maxim and acting on it is only a rational thing for me to do if it's sanctioned by my reasons. Right? So if I have a principle that I can come to know to be true a priori just by reflecting on it, and that principle sanctions acting on this maxim, then it's okay for me to act on it. But if there's no principle that sanctions acting on the maxim, it would be totally irrational for me to act on it. And Kant thinks that since I'm a rational creature, I have this duty only to do what I have good enough reasons for doing. So if there's no a priori principle that sanctions acting on this maxim, it would be wrong for me to act on it. And sadly, when it comes to the 3 thick slices of chocolate cake for breakfast, the sad truth is that my inclination just by itself, my desire, is not a sufficient reason for me to eat the 3 slices of cake for breakfast instead of a nice healthy breakfast. And I can see that this is not a sufficient reason just by reflecting a priori, right? A sufficient reason is one that endorses a kind of behavior anytime it's true, right? So it would have to be the case that anytime some cake is tasty or anytime I really want cake, it's okay for me to eat the cake, right? And I can see that this isn't the case just by reflecting, right? I can think it through. If wanting the cake were a sufficient reason for eating it, then even after I've eaten some cake, if I still wanted some, I'd have a good enough reason for eating it, right? Even after I've eaten a really nutritious meal and I can't possibly fit any more in, so long as I want the cake, I would still have the very same reason that I have right now, that it would be tasty, that I really want it. And since it can't be a reason in all of those cases, it can't be a sufficient reason right now. So if I do have sufficient reason for eating 3 thick slices of chocolate cake for breakfast, the reason has to consist in something additional, something more than just my desire to eat the cake. So now we come to what J. David Velleman says about Kant's view concerning our duties. According to Velleman, Kant's view is that our duty is to act on a maxim only if we also have a principle endorsing the reason specified in that maxim as sufficient for the specified action. So in my case, my maxim is to eat a whole bunch of chocolate cake in the interest of eating some tasty food, and I am permitted to act on that maxim only if there is a principle that supports or endorses acting on it. For short, we're going to say that Kant's first formulation is that you should act only for a good enough reason, right? If there is not sufficient reason for you to do something, then you may not do it. The thing about reasons is that when something's a good enough reason for action, it's something that this is something I can know a priori, right? Just by thinking it through. And it's also a fact that any other reasoner who has the same reasoning capacities that I do could come to know a priori. So we'll say that reasons, sufficient reasons, are public property. They are the sort of things that can be intuited by any rational agent whatsoever. In this respect, they're a lot like the truths of arithmetic and geometry and the basic truths of logic, right? So I can come to know that if John loves Mary, and Mary loves John, then John loves Mary, right? That's just a basic truth of logic. If A and B, then A. And this isn't like a special fact that's only accessible to me privately. Any reasoner could come to know this fact. So similarly, if wanting a piece of chocolate cake is a sufficient reason for eating a piece of chocolate cake, then I can know this a priori, and so can everybody else. Another example, right? So being thirsty is a sufficient reason for drinking some water. If that's true, then I can come to know it a priori, and so can every other rational agent who bothers to think about it. According to Kant, it's wrong to act on a maxim when there's no a priori principle that endorses it. So let's take as an example this maxim. To tell others a falsehood purely in the interest of being believed. So suppose, for example, that I want all my students to think that I wrote a best-selling book on Kant, when in fact I have written no such book. So I contemplate acting on the maxim to tell my students this falsehood because I want them to believe it. I can act on this maxim, according to Kant, only if there's a sufficient reason that endorses it. But there's not. I can't act on this maxim because there's no a priori principle that endorses it. Suppose that there were. Suppose there were an a priori principle that endorsed acting on the maxim of telling others a falsehood whenever you wanted to be believed. If there were such a principle, not only would I be able to know it a priori, but every rational agent would be able to know it a priori. And furthermore, every rational agent would also know that every other rational agent would know it a priori. This is just what it means to say that reasons are public property. We all know about reasons and we can reason about them, and we all know that any rational agent is capable of doing the same reasoning as we are. So if it were okay to lie to others just because you want to be believed, everybody would know that there's a principle that supports this kind of behavior. But if everybody knew that, and everybody knew that everybody knew that, then nobody would ever take anybody's word for anything. Right? So if you knew that it was a sufficient reason to lie because you just wanted to be believed, and somebody asserted something to you, you would have adequate grounds for demanding more evidence, right? For demanding more than just their word. So you would withhold judgment on anything that anybody said until you got more evidence. And you could reason this through a priori, and so could everybody else. Okay. What is Kant not saying? So let's make sure that we're not confusing Kant's moral principle with any consequentialist doctrine. So Kant is not saying that you should avoid lying because lying causes harm. This might very well be true. In fact, it probably is true in general about lying, but it's not Kant's reason for saying you shouldn't lie. Also, he's not saying that you should avoid lying because when you lie, it encourages others to lie. Nor is he saying that lying as a general practice undermines the practice of telling the truth. These aren't the reasons that Kant gives. These are all consequentialist reasons for avoiding lying. According to Kant, you shouldn't lie because there's no a priori principle, right, that endorses the maxim to tell others a falsehood when I want to be believed. Because there's no sufficient reason for acting on that maxim, it would be wrong for a rational agent to act on it. Another way of thinking about this is to connect it up with the second formulation of the categorical imperative that we'll talk about in another presentation. Kant says that you shouldn't treat other people or yourself like a mere means. And if you act when you don't have a good enough reason for acting, you are treating yourself as though you don't need good enough reasons for acting. So you're treating yourself like a non-rational creature. But you are a rational creature. And it's wrong to treat a rational creature like it's non-rational, right? You'd be treating yourself as though you were like a mere instrument to be used in order to satisfy your desires, for example. And that might be an acceptable way for a lion or a bear to behave, but it's not an acceptable way for a human being to behave, because human beings are rational creatures. Okay, so one last thing. A lot of folks tend to confuse Kant's moral theory with a moral theory that sounds a little similar. So my mom used to say, if you don't want everybody to do it, or you wouldn't want everyone to do it, you shouldn't do it yourself, right? So her moral theory was act only when you wouldn't mind others acting that way. And a lot of people confuse Kant's moral theory with this view. So Kant is not saying don't do something just because you wouldn't want everybody to do it. He's saying don't do something if there's not a reason that is sufficient for you to act on, right? Now, it's true that if there's not a reason that is sufficient for you to act on, it's also true that there's no reason that's sufficient for others who are in your situation to act on. But what's important here is the absence of the reason, not the fact that you wouldn't want others acting that way. Okay, so let's sum up. Kant's theory is not your mom's moral theory, right? Kant says act only for good enough reasons. Your mom says don't do it if you wouldn't want others doing it. Kant's theory is a non-consequentialist theory, which means that sometimes the act that's morally right is not the one that maximizes utility, and sometimes an act that does maximize utility is not the one that's right. And also, people have moral obligations because we are capable of acting for reasons. So what sets us apart from other creatures like lions, tigers, bears, and dogs is that those animals act purely out of inclination, whereas we are capable of acting contrary to our inclinations on the basis of good enough reasons. Okay, so that's the first formulation of the categorical imperative.